So these past few weeks, as we are in this Lenten season, we have been looking at this section of John's Gospel, the beginning of kind of the second half of his Gospel, and everything that we have been looking at these past few weeks has taken place on the night of the Last Supper. That last night, right before Jesus is betrayed and arrested, and he's denied by Peter, one of his closest friends, and then ultimately crucified. We have been spending time in that last night before all of that happens. And so last week, and this week, and next week, everything that we're looking at is the final words, or as scholars call it, the final discourse of Jesus, his final time of teaching, telling and calling and challenging and promising and assuring and giving really the marching orders for everything that's to follow for his disciples. That's what's going on, these chapters in John, chapters 13 through 17. And if you do the math, John is 21 chapters long, so this final discourse, chapters 13 through 17, it's 5 chapters. It's about a full quarter of John's Gospel is spent just on this last discourse, this last bit of conversation and teaching and encouraging and calling and challenging for his disciples. Everything Jesus says is important, but if there are things that we should kind of pull out as words to really define what he was about, if we're going to pull out some words that will help us understand everything else he said and did, and is calling all of us to follow after, and the vision that he's giving us of what the Christian life is about, well, the last words on this last night, as Jesus knows that this is the culmination and these are his parting words to his disciples, I would suggest that these are words to really pay attention to. So last week, we looked at how he begins this discourse with that new command. If you remember that new command to love one another as he has loved us. And next week, we're going to look at the end of this final discourse, which is his prayer for us. And so today, we're going to be right in the middle of it. Right here in John 15, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 17. If you want to follow along when we read them here in just a minute, you can find them in the Pew Bibles beginning on, what page is it? Beginning on page 109. So we're going to be in John 15, verses 1 through 17. Let's pray as we go to God's Word this morning. Lord, as we read and hear your Word, Lord, send your Spirit filling us, guiding us, and leading us, that the words that we hear, the words that we read, the words that we meditate on, the words that we examine, they would not just be words printed on a page or sounds in the air, but they might point us to the life we have in you. They might take root in our hearts, growing, challenging, changing, and forming us into the people you call us to be. That we might not just be hearers of the word, but we might be doers of the word as well. In Christ's name, amen. In John 15, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I am giving you these commands, so that you may love one another. Friends, this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So this here is a wonderfully rich image and vision of life that Jesus gives us. This is a wonderfully rich metaphor that Jesus gives us here about what it means to be his people, to be the church. Now, this picture that he paints of a vine with all of its branches and fruit that the branches are supposed to produce, and God as the vine grower or the gardener, as vivid of an image as it may be to us. The fact is that Jesus' first disciples and the early church that would read and hear this text, well, the image would have been even more profound and more vivid. And to some of the early readers or hearers of this image, well, it would have also been an image and a vision that was maybe had a little twist to it and was probably a little challenging. And so to help us unpack what's going on here, what Jesus is saying, we're going to explore a little bit of the history of this image of a vine and branches that are meant to produce fruit, and this image of God as the vine grower or the gardener. See, I suspect that many of us, maybe not all of us, but many of us here, may be fairly disconnected with the sort of picture and agricultural work that's at the root of the image. That's a pun. You can laugh at that. That's okay. It's at the root of this image that Jesus uses here. But for you gardeners out there, maybe you might understand what's going on here a little bit better than the rest of us. And certainly for the people that Jesus hung out with, they knew agriculture, right? That was the world that they lived in, right? We live in kind of a world that's really an information kind of economy, right? We deal with moving bits of information around on computers and all sorts of, that's kind of the world that we tend to live in a lot of the time. Well, they lived in a world that was kind of founded on agriculture and growing things. That's what you needed to survive. It was a part of their daily lives. And so they knew this image well. But also, if you were a Jew at the time of Jesus, hearing someone talk about a vineyard or a vine, well, that would also bring with it all sorts of other deeper emotions and ideas and thoughts and images and all sorts of things like that. Because you see, the image of a vineyard or the image of a grapevine, it was used throughout the Bible, throughout what we call the Old Testament, to talk about Israel as God's people. And so various passages, you can look at various passages in the prophets, for example. You can look at Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, all these prophets. They use this image of God planting a vineyard, planting a vine, and cultivating it, and growing it, and even pruning it so that it will yield fruit. Or the Psalms. This is an image that's in the Psalms too. Psalm 80, for example, says you, the Lord, you brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and you planted it. You cleared the ground for it, and it took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. See, in these passages, we are pointed to the fact that the vine or the vineyard that God is cultivating stands for his people. The vine is God's people. But even more than that, God's people also have been and are being cultivated for a purpose. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. God, in this image, is cultivating a vine, cultivating a vineyard to bring blessing and shalom and hope and promise to the world, to all of creation. That's the image that's going on here with this image of a vine or a vineyard. And so this image was so strong in the ethos and the consciousness of Israel, of God's people, that they even put a vine on their coins as a reminder of who they were, as a symbol of their nation. On their coins was a vine. And even more than that, at the entrance to the temple in Jerusalem, there was a vine. Think about that for a second. The temple was the holy site, right? Yes, God is with you wherever you went, but the temple? Well, the temple, that's where God's presence really was. That's where God's presence rested fully in the earth. The temple was where sacrifices and offerings of thanksgiving happened. The temple was where grace and forgiveness happened. The temple was where heaven and earth came together, where the presence of the Lord was mediated to his people and indeed to the earth. The temple was the place you could look to know who you were, to know what you belonged to know who you belonged to. And in fact, who you were, your religious life, your social life, your economic life, your political life, every part of your identity was wrapped up in everything that this temple stood for and represented. The covenant and God's promises to you and to the people, and through that for the world. And at its entrance was an image of a golden vine with a crop of large grape clusters. The entrance to a church may have a cross. The entrance to the temple had a fruit-bearing vine on it. That is how important this vine and vineyard image was. Because it was a statement of purpose, a statement of identity, a statement of promise. Just as the temple carried all this meaning behind it, so too now did this image of the vine. All of those passages, they talk about God deliberately planting and cultivating his vineyard, growing and pruning, getting his hands dirty in the soil to make sure the vine grows, the vineyard grows. And those passages also reference, when you go read them, they reference the grief that happens when the vine isn't bearing the fruit it's supposed to. And so to be a part of God's people, to belong to Israel at this time, meant you belong to God. It meant you belong to his people. You were a part of the vine and the vineyard. Because that's where salvation is found. And it also meant that you were called to be the people through which salvation and blessing was to be had for all the nations, right? That's the fruit that God was cultivating his vine and vineyard for. And yet when you go back and you read some of these passages, you read the prophetic passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea, what you also see is that God planted and cultivated and watered and nourished and guarded his vineyard, guarded the vine that he had planted. And yet there are times when the vine did not yield the fruit that he was looking for. Just as an example from Isaiah 5, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. The vineyard did not always produce the fruit it was supposed to. So God raised up the prophets to call his people back to this purpose. And that's when they speak of God pruning his vine, pruning his vineyard so that it will produce the fruit it's supposed to. Pruning is how the prophets often spoke of God's judgment and things like exile into foreign lands. Pruning the vine was a part of cultivating it to yet fulfill its purpose. And so what happened was that the vineyard and the vine imagery became intertwined with both Israel's history and her hope and future. This history of exodus and exile and return and homecoming and this hope that one day God was going to make all things right, that this vineyard would truly take root and produce the full, wonderful, sweet fruit it was always meant to produce. So if you were a part of this community, back when Jesus was speaking these words, this vine, this vineyard, it was an image you knew. And it stood for everything that gave you your identity, your past, your present, and your hope for the future. It was an image that defined who you were. And so all of this is lurking here in the background, and maybe not so much in the background. It's lurking here when Jesus says to his disciples on this last night, in John 15, which again, keep in mind, this is part of the last words Jesus has with his disciples before he is arrested and crucified. All of this vine and vineyard imagery and history and hope, it's right there when Jesus now says, I am the true vine. My Father is the vine grower. And so when we hear these words in this context, with all of this going on in the background, well, now these words of Jesus, they become something much more than Jesus just pulling out a cute little sermon illustration or some sort of convenient, spontaneous metaphor. Everything about the vine is here in his words. Everything that it meant and stood for. The purpose of bearing fruit and God pruning the branches so they will become even more fruitful. But the twist is now Jesus says, guess what? I am the vine. I am the true vine. Genuine, authentic, or dependable. That's what that word means there. Jesus is saying he is the genuine, authentic vine to which Israel, to which God's chosen and covenant people was always meant to point toward. Jesus is saying he is the fulfillment of what God had been up to throughout all those generations of cultivating and growing and pruning and nourishing and getting his hands dirty with his people. And Jesus is also saying he is the very assurance of that promise, right here, standing in front of you in the flesh. Because as we see in the prophets, quite frankly, probably as many of us see in the mirror, right? We're in the season of Lent, a time of self-examination, so it's okay. We can admit this together today, right? That we are unable to be often that vineyard and that vine that always produces the best fruit, aren't we? Sometimes the fruit we produce is not so good. Sometimes it's downright rotten, or at the very least, there always seems to be weeds that are kind of growing up with the right alongside the vine that God is growing in the branches and the fruit, right? There seem to be weeds there. But Jesus is the vine that cannot disappoint the gardener. Jesus is the one who will bear the good and perfect fruit. Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, he is the one was able to fulfill his people's destiny and calling to be the vineyard of God. That is the context and what's going on at the heart of this entire passage. Of this discussion about the pruning of branches and keeping commandments to love one another and the bearing of fruit. You see, if we miss that context of who Jesus is saying he really is at the root of all of this, if we miss it, if we miss the fact that all of that about Jesus as the vine, that it's Jesus that is the true vine, if we miss that, when we read about Jesus talking about keeping and obeying his commandments, of calling us to do even the very things that we so often don't really seem able to do all that well. And without that context, this passage becomes more of a judgment, doesn't it? We read about branches being cut off, and that sounds pretty bad. Right? Do you get why the context matters of who Jesus really is in the midst of all of this? In the midst of talking about branches remaining and abiding in the vine, in the midst of talking about the need for pruning to happen in order for it to be more fruitful, in the midst of talking about keeping his commandments and abiding in him, in the midst of talking about loving one another with the same good and selfless love the Father has for the Son and the Son has for us, in the midst of all of these things that could otherwise become quite a daunting, and if you're like me, anxiety-producing checklist to try to accomplish. In the midst of all of that is this image of Jesus as the true vine, and us simply as the branches. The vine remains intertwined with our history and our hope. Now even those of us wild branches that have been grafted onto the true vine, it remains the image of that into which we are called and invited to find our true identity. Only now, says Jesus, it's him. It's he who is this true vine. And so he says, abide in me as I abide in you. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Because branches have no life of their own, do they? At least not the life that they're meant for. Branches, their life comes from the life that is coursing through the vine to which they are attached. As goes the vine, so goes the branches, right? The life of a branch is bound up in the life of the vine. And branches don't become attached to the vine because of the fruit they bear, but rather they bear fruit because of the vine they are attached to. And the fruit that they bear is itself an outgrowth of the life of the vine. That's the promise that is at the heart of this, of the heart of what Jesus is saying to his disciples on this final night, this night that is growing darker by the minute, this night that is bringing with it questions of purpose and meaning, questions of identity and relationship and calling, and what all of this is about, as certainly for them and us as we are in this season of Lent, as the shadow of the cross is looming larger and larger. In this night of questions and uncertainty, doubts and fears, Jesus says, my Father is the gardener, I am the vine. You are the branches. And so your job is to simply abide in me and trust the life that I give you. Now branches, of course, they sometimes get a little wild, a little unruly. Those of you who garden know this very well. All right? Sometimes they can become a tangled mess. Sometimes pruning needs to happen. In fact, if you really want to get the best, sweetest grapes from a grapevine, even before they get out of hand, the vine grower, the gardener, comes along and prunes. Sometimes maybe even pruning off the first glimpses of fruit, because that's how the better, sweeter fruit will come in later in the season. And if you've ever been to a vineyard out of season, you know it doesn't look like much. Things can look dead and completely unfruitful. But what happens when the next season rolls around? You realize that no, life was at work all along, right? There's evidence now in the next season that life has been at work underground and in the vine. Even though it didn't look like much, life was at work. So this passage is not some sort of threat that if you don't produce the right kind of fruit, or even enough fruit or whatever, that God's just waiting to snap you off from the vine. No, these words of Jesus are the words of our perfect and loving friend, reminding and calling us to remain and abide in that place where true, eternal, resurrected life actually is. They are a reminder of who you are, and that come what may, you are a branch on the vine, a friend of Jesus. And they are a reminder that even the pruning is an act of grace and utmost care and provision and love for you. And so what profound words of grace and promise and assurance to his disciples on this final night. And also for us. Because there are certainly seasons, aren't there, in our lives, just as there are seasons in the life of vineyards and vines. There are seasons of winter where it may appear that there is nothing growing. And there are seasons of pruning that are sometimes hard and painful. There are those times when life seems to have stopped, at least the fruitful, abundant life that we hope for. But even then, the promise here is that even then, even in those times, there is life in the vine that is at work, bringing forth life even where there was once only a fruitless branch. And not just any fruit, but fruit that will last. Actually, what that really says there at the end of this passage that has been all about abiding and remaining in Jesus, who abides and remains in us abiding in his love, just as Jesus abides in the Father's love. And this fruit that he talks about here, this fruit that will last, what he actually says is go and bear fruit. Fruit that will abide. Fruit that will remain. This passage, here on the eve of what is quite honestly everything falling apart for these disciples that he's speaking to. Goodness, what a promise this is. A promise about who Jesus is, come what may. A promise about who you are, come what may. A promise about your calling and purpose and significance, come what may. A promise about the steadfastness and faithfulness and provision of the God who has created and called you. And so it is in light of this promise that Jesus says, abide in me as I abide in you. And with this promise of good news, because it's the season of Lent, we're not getting off easy. Because with this promise of good news of the gospel, we are also invited into the challenge of the gospel. As we find ourselves on this journey toward the cross with Jesus, the question that he raises here for us, how are we abiding in him? How are you abiding in him? And where are we not abiding in him? Where are those places we find ourselves abiding instead? Perhaps abiding or remaining in fear. Or abiding or remaining in apathy. Or cynicism. Or maybe abiding in unforgiveness. Or remaining in unrepentance. or abiding in a place where we can't receive God's forgiveness. Where are those places that we find ourselves abiding that are not in Jesus? Friends, those are good questions for the journey. Good questions to reflect on and to lift up to God. Because He has already said who you are and who He has called and created you to be. A branch of the one who is true and steadfast. A branch of the one in whom is the life that abides. Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit. Indeed, they bear fruit that abides. Remember who you are, a branch abiding in the true vine, that you may go and bear much fruit. Let's pray. Lord, that you are the true vine. For that we give you thanks. Lord, through your Spirit, may we abide in you. May we examine ourselves for those places where we are not abiding in you. And through your grace, Lord, graft us back in. Keep us remaining in you, that your life may be our life, that we may go and bear the fruit that abides. Lord, that is our prayer, for that is your vision for your people. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. As we